Hello everyone and welcome back to our channel. What Wyatt Spencer just discovered in that office is the kind of revelation that doesn't just change a single life. It rewrites the history of everyone connected to it. And I genuinely cannot stop thinking about every layer of what this means. It started as a perfectly ordinary afternoon in the Spencer offices. Wyatt working through a stack of documents, mind elsewhere, going through the motions, and then a single medical file, tucked away where it had no business being. Cracked his world clean open. Hidden inside that folder was a truth that had been buried for years, locked away beneath layers of fear and calculated silence by someone who convinced themselves they were making the right decision. Wyatt has a child, a grown child, and her name is Dylan. A woman who has been quietly weaving herself into his life for weeks, stirring something in him he couldn't name because, on some level deeper than conscious thought, he already knew. Let's set the scene because the atmosphere of this discovery matters. Late autumn sunlight coming through the tall windows of the Spencer office, long shadows stretching across the floor. Wyatt going through paperwork on Leon's behalf while his mind drifted somewhere else entirely. He had been distracted for weeks, and the reason for that distraction had a name. Dylan, smart, guarded, carrying herself with a self containment that Wyatt found simultaneously familiar and difficult to place. Her presence had been growing in his life, steadily, and with it had come something he genuinely struggled to explain, a sense of recognition that felt older than their acquaintance, a comfort that sat strangely alongside unease, like a memory living just beyond reach. He had tried to rationalize it, told himself it was his natural empathy or simply the product of spending more time around someone. But the feeling refused to diminish. If anything, it intensified with every interaction, every shared look, every moment where she said something and he felt it resonate somewhere deep in his chest before he had consciously processed it. There was one specific moment, Dylan laughing at something inconsequential, completely unguarded for just a second, where Wyatt felt tightening in his chest so unexpected and so profound that it stopped him cold. He didn't understand it yet, but that was the first real fracture in the version of reality he had been living in. Something was trying to surface, and he didn't yet have the language for what it was. The discovery itself happened almost accidentally, the way the most life altering moments often do. He wasn't searching for anything particular, just looking for something unrelated when a file caught his attention, buried somewhere it had absolutely no reason to be. A medical document, and then a name he hasn't let himself think about in a long time, one attached to a history of love and loss and questions he had never asked out loud. He nearly moved past it, nearly, but something made him open it. What he found inside dismantled him slowly, and then all at once. Dates that didn't match what he remembered being told. References to a birth, to a child, to circumstances that had never been shared with him. I mean, just imagine what that feels like sitting in a familiar office in the middle of an ordinary afternoon and watching the architecture of your own history collapse in real time. His hands were trembling as he read the same lines over and over, as if repetition might change what they said, as if his brain was running the information through one more time in the hope that the conclusion would somehow be different. It wasn't. At first, the denial was instinctive and total. There had to be a mistake. The file belonged to someone else. He was misreading it. He was jumping to conclusions. But Wyatt is not a man who fools himself indefinitely, and the connections were too specific, too consistent, pointing with growing unmistakable certainty in a single direction. Dylan was not simply someone who had recently entered his orbit. She was connected to him in a way that redefined the entire shape of their relationship. She was his daughter, and that word daughter sat in the air of his mind like something foreign and enormous, refusing to be absorbed all at once. He had always thought about having children as something that belonged to the future, possibility not yet arrived. The realization that he already had a child, a fully grown person who had lived an entire life without him, was disorienting in a way that is almost impossible to adequately describe. Exhilarating and devastating at the exact same time, fragments of memory began surfacing, a relationship that ended more abruptly than it should have, a goodbye that never felt complete, questions he had suppressed without fully understanding why. It was all starting to reconstruct itself into a new shape, one that made a different and terrible kind of sense. But underneath all of it, underneath the shock and the grief and the slowly building anger, was the question that loomed over everything else. Why had this been kept from him? Who had known? And perhaps most urgently, did Dylan know? He couldn't sit with it silently. That was never going to be an option. Not for Wyatt, not with something this enormous. He needed answers from the one person who had been holding this secret, and the confrontation that followed was one of the most emotionally raw and charged of his life. When he finally came face to face with her, the air between them was thick with everything that had been unsaid for years, with the weight of a decision made long ago that was finally being forced into the light. She tried to redirect at first, tried to hold the structure of the story she had so carefully maintained, but Weird had grown in ways she clearly hadn't anticipated. He could read a situation now in ways he couldn't when he was younger, and what he was reading in her responses was undeniable. The truth came out in fragments, each one landing harder than the last. She had been frightened, she said frightened of what this would mean for Wyatt's life, frightened of the complications, the disruptions, the possibility of it all unraveling in ways she couldn't control or predict. She had told herself she was protecting everyone involved, protecting Wyatt, protecting the child, protecting herself, and in that fear, she had made a choice that removed his entirely. His choice to know his chance to be father, his right to understand his own history, years of fatherhood lost, a childhood he was never part of, moments that cannot be recovered, and why he was only finding out now. Wyatt listened to all of it, and what he felt was not simple. It was a storm of anger and heart and confusion, and something underneath all of those. That was harder to name, a complicated, painful empathy that allowed him to understand the fear, even while he refused to accept what it had cost him. Understanding is not forgiveness, it is not absolution, and it absolutely does not answer the question of what happens next. Because now there was Dylan, still out there, still carrying a version of her history that was about to be completely dismantled. Telling her felt like a detonating something irrepressible, not telling her was simply not possible. The truth was already in motion, already refusing to stay contained, and Viet knew from long experience that secrets kept beyond their natural lifespan always do more damage when they finally break. He had to be the one to tell her he had to try to do this right. Sitting down with Dylan was one of the most difficult things he had ever done. Finding words for something this complex, this life altering, this completely without precedent in both their experiences. There was no script for it. It was confusion move across her face as she tried to follow what he was saying, trying to build meaning from pieces that didn't yet fit together in her mind. And then the moment it landed, slowly, unmistakably, the way a wave doesn't break all at once but builds and builds before it finally crashes. She didn't believe him immediately. Of course, she didn't. This isn't the kind of thing people absorb in a single moment. It sounds like something out of a dramatic story, too large and too sudden to be revealed. But we had showed her the evidence, laid out the documentation, gave her no space to doubt the facts, even while every instinct she had was fighting to reject them. And as reality began to settle in, her expression moved through disbelief, then shock, then a quiet, deeply heartbreaking sadness that said more than any words could have. Everything she had understood about her own life, the foundations of it, the story of it, was crumbling in real time. The people she thought she knew, the history she had been given, all of it was being rewritten in a single conversation by a man she had only recently begun to trust. And now that man was telling her he was her father. The silence that came after was enormous. Wyatt didn't feel it. He understood that this was hers to sit inside, hers to process, hers to eventually respond to in whatever way she needed. All he could offer was honesty, presence, and patience. The ripple effects of this revelation are already spreading in every direction, touching and destabilizing relationships, reopening old wounds, and forcing everyone in their circle to examine what they knew and when they knew it. Some people are responding with support, encouraging Wyatt to be present and persistent, to fight for a relationship with Dylan regardless of how complicated the path is. Others are more measured, more cautious, reminding him that years of absence, even involuntary absence, cannot simply be erased by good intentions and a willingness to show up now. Both responses are valid, but reflect real truths about how situations like this actually work. For Dylan, the journey ahead is arguably even harder than Wyatt's. She has to navigate an entirely reconstructed identity while also deciding whether she has the capacity to build something new with a father she never had the chance to know. That is not a simple ask. It is an enormous emotional undertaking, and the moments where she feels overwhelmed, where she questions everything, where trust feels like a luxury she can't afford, those moments are completely understandable. But woven through all of that difficulty, there are also glimpses of something fragile and important: the possibility of healing, of genuine connection, of a relationship that, though it started in the most complicated way imaginable, might still become something real and meaningful. And then, of course, there is the new twist gathering on the horizon, because in this world, no revelation arrives without bringing something else in its wake. Whatever is coming next is threatening to complicate things even further, and the fact that it arrives just as things had barely begun to settle tells you everything about how relentless this story is willing to do. Here is what strikes me most about this storyline. It is not just a dramatic reveal, it is a deeply human story about what happens when fear drives a decision that removes someone else's agency entirely. The woman who kept the secret convinced herself she was doing the right thing, and maybe some part of her genuinely believed that. But the road paved with that kind of protection leads straight to exactly the kind of damage we are watching now. We had lost years. Dylan lost a father. She deserved the chance to know, and no amount of explanation makes that okay. What makes the story work is that it doesn't pretend otherwise. It holds all of that complexity without resolving it too cleanly, without letting anyone completely off the hook. That is the kind of writing that earns it emotional moments. So here where we are. Wyatt is a father who is only just finding out. Dylan is a daughter whose entire sense of self has just been rewritten. And somewhere on the horizon, another complication is already forming that promises to make everything even harder before it gets easier. I need to know what you are thinking. Do you believe Dylan will eventually open the door to a real relationship with Wyatt, or has too much time passed and too much damage been done? And who do you think is most responsible for what it cost both of them? Tell me everything in the comments below. Give this video a thumbs up if this storyline has you completely invested, and make sure you subscribe so you are right here when the next twist lands. Because based on everything we have seen so far, it is going to change everything all over again.